Welcome everybody. Welcome back. Happy New Year to Anne. Welcome to this eighth seminar as part of the Contemporary Women's Writing and Medical Humanities seminar series. Today we have it's our eighth seminar, and the theme is, the title is End of Life Narratives, Narratives, Resilience and Care. This seminar series, it's organised with the support of the Centre for Contemporary Women's Writing at the Institute of Modern Languages Research in London. This online seminar series, as I'm sure many of you are aware, I see a lot of regular listeners coming back, which is great. So this series, it's for postgraduates and early career researchers, and it seeks to explore how contemporary women's writing in particular, whether it's fiction, poetry, autobiography, or philosophical writing, is currently engaging with issues such as illness, disease, healthcare, medical practice, and clinical institutions. There are a wide range of themes being covered, and we are accepting ongoing abstracts as well as abstracts for our extended conference, which will be happening later this year in the summer, also to be conducted online. So yes, if any of you have any ideas, even tentative ideas, just feel free to get in touch with Ben and I, and we'll be putting details and the email address in the chat later. We started back in September 2020, and we're continuing until March 2021. These seminars are always fortnightly, and they always happen on Tuesday evenings at 5:30, not British Summer Time anymore, GMT, until roughly 7 p.m. You can register for the seminars via the IMLR, and we'll be putting the link in the chat later for the next seminar in 2 weeks' time. And you can also have a look at the upcoming seminars and the themes and speakers coming up. Okay, now for some Zoom house rules. This session is being recorded, so it can be uploaded to the IMLR website. Please feel free to turn your cameras off or on, whichever you feel most comfortable with. We'll be having the 3 15-minute papers today, and then a Q&A session. If you could all remain on mute too during the papers until the Q&A session, this will be much appreciated. During the Q&A, if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to use the raise hand option on Zoom, which is if you go into participants and then hover over your name more, and then it should pop up as one of the options to raise your hand with a little emoji thing. You can also write your questions in the chat kind of during the papers as they come to you, inspiration, or you can write them later. You can speak them out loud yourself, again by doing the raise hand option. Or messaging Ben and I, or Stephen, we've got our moderator today, and we can you can either say them out loud, or you can nominate one of us to read them out for you if that's what you're most comfortable with. I think, yep, that's it. Okay, so I'm going to pass over one more thing. Sorry, I nearly forgot. What we're doing at the moment is you can kind of see at the bottom, we're doing kind of automatic captioning, live captioning. It's not entirely perfect, but it's okay. So I think you should all be able to see it, but if you can't, if you hover over the CC icon at the bottom with the other kind of participants, etc. Zoom options, and then it should come up as like the automatic live captioning. And we'll also be doing something called auto description. So myself and Ben, as well as Stephen, our moderator, and our speakers will give a brief kind of description of ourselves. And any images as well during the speaker's papers will be briefly described. So my auto description is 29-year-old, nearly 30, gosh, British woman with hair in a bun and gold glasses and like a blue top with white flowers on it. Okay, I think that's it. So I'll pass over to Ben, who's going to do our intro of Stephen.
Thanks very much, Becky. Happy New Year, everyone. Thanks very much for coming to the session. So I'll just quickly audio describe. My name is Benjamin Dalton, and I'm a 29, also almost 30, white man with a big brown beard, and I'm wearing a kind of reddish, almost velvety shirt. So I'm very, very happy today to introduce our guest chair, Dr. Stephen Wilson. So Stephen Wilson is Senior Lecturer in French Studies at Queen's University Belfast. His research is concerned with the ways in which modern French literature from the 19th century to the present contributes to cultural understandings and linguistic articulations of illness, disease, pain, medical practice, and dying and death. His monograph, The Language of Disease, Writing Syphilis in 19th Century France, was published by Legende last year. He has guest edited 2 special issues of L'Esprit Créateur, one on French autopathography, including end-of-life narratives, and one to appear this spring on French thanatology. He has also guest edited a special issue of Modern and Contemporary France on l'imaginaire médico-religieux, modern French literary perspectives, and with Dr. Loic Bordeaux from Louisiana and Professor Natalie Edwards from Adelaide. The Australian Journal of French Studies, Journal of French Studies on the care return in contemporary French and Francophone cultural productions. He is currently working with Dr. Anna Elsner on a project on European cultures of palliative care. So thanks very much, Stephen. I'll pass over to you now.
Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you, Becky, for the introduction. Just to describe myself, I am a late someone in their late 30s who has got brown hair and blue eyes, who is wearing a blue checked shirt this evening, and who, having been back at work for only 2 days after a very long Christmas break, has got extremely baggy eyes already. I'm delighted to be here this evening to be sharing this event, and I just want to say a big shout out, a big thank you to Ben and Becky for the series so far. It's been absolutely brilliant. I've been to most of them so far, and the discussion has been very rich, and the papers have been really important, I think. And you know, as Ben was reading out there that list of publications, and I was looking down the audience, and lovely to see people like Loic here this evening and Anna Elsner here this evening, people with whom I've collaborated in recent years. I was thinking back to that publication of French autopathography in 2016, and for me there was something of a moment about that, and that sort of period. 2014, we did a conference in Belfast. 2016, it was published as a special issue. Anna Elsner is part of the special issue. And for me, there was something important about that moment in the mid-2010s when modern languages were beginning to really intersect with the medical humanities in quite an important way. And as I was looking over that publication just this afternoon, in fact, I was looking at it through the prism of gender in preparation for this evening, and I noticed that out of the 9 articles that we have in that special issue, that 4 of them have women writers or feature women writers, and the other 5 were male writers, and it got me questioning the sort of trajectory in lots of illness writing in this contemporary period, because it seems to me that the vast majority of cultural output on illness these days is written by or produced by women. And the other thing that it got me thinking about was that in some ways, and I think, you know, this series epitomizes this, in some ways I think we're at another really important moment in the role of modern languages with the medical humanities. If I look back on that special issue of 2016, which I'm very proud of, we were seeking there to bring voices from the French-speaking world to this debate, a debate that people like Arthur Frank had started off before that on how medicine can conspire to take away the patient's voice. And we were looking to give back the voice to the patient in many ways. But actually, it seems to me that in this moment that we are in now, in sort of 2020, 2021, that there's a new articulation of medical humanities and modern languages, thinking much more critically about things like the identity of the patient, the identity of the doctor, issues of race, issues of sexuality, issues of ethnicity, issues of age, issues of gender are being questioned much more in all of this as well. And I think that women's writing is leading the way in asking so many of these important questions. So I'm really excited about tonight's seminar, and we have 3 brilliant speakers who are going to be sharing with us various perspectives from France, from Canada, and from Italy as well. And I'm delighted to present, first of all, Adina Stroya, who is an independent scholar from the UK, and she is an early career researcher in the field of women's life writing and visual culture. Adina is also a former visiting fellow at the Centre for the Study of Contemporary Women's Writing at the IMLR in London. And her research focuses on psychoanalysis, thanatography, aging, ethics of care, and visual studies. Her most recent publications include Camille Laurence, L'écriture depuis soi in Dalhousie French Studies, and The Traumatic Structure of the Récit de Mort, Camille Laurence's Philippe in French and Francophone Studies. And Adina's current project investigates the ways in which Agnes Varda mobilizes the tension between photography and moving image to represent her own aging process in her late documentaries. So thank you, Adina, for being with us today. Your paper this afternoon is entitled The End of Care, Notes on Assisted Suicide in Noël Châtelet's La Dernière Leçon.
Thank you. Thank you very much to Becky and Ben for having me. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. So I am a 32-year-old white female. I have long hair and I am wearing all black in theme with today's paper. So I'll just share my screen. Okay. Good. Okay, all good? Okay. So my paper today is entitled The End of Care, Notes on Assisted Suicide in Noël Châtelet, La Dernière Leçon. Okay. So before I start, I'd like to issue multiple trigger warnings. The paper today deals with the death of an elderly parent and involves, in one form or another, discussions of suicide. So please feel free to mute me at any time the subject matter gets too heavy, because it will. As it says in the title, these are notes on the text. This is quite new terrain for me, although my work does sit at the intersection of mourning and aging at present. So it's very much work in progress. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts. So by way of introduction, I'll start my paper today in a less ordinary fashion by making reference to a poem which encapsulates the very affects and intentionalities at play within the works I will be discussing. What follows is an excerpt from Margaret Atwood's latest poetry collection, Dearly, published in Annus Horribilis 2020, and it's from a poem entitled Flatline, and I'll try to do it some justice. After a lifetime of tangling of knotted snares and lacework, of purple headspace tornadoes with their heart race and rubble, you crave the end of mazes and pray for a wide shore, an ocean with its horizon, not so much bliss, but a flat line you steer for. The question of which vessel we are to use to reach that much wanted white shore subtends today's paper, centered around Noël Châtelet, La Dernière Leçon, the last or final lesson, published in 2004, and its sequel, if I may use such a word in a literary context, Suite à la Dernière Leçon. La Dernière Leçon deals with the announced death of the author's mother, a midwife by profession, who at 92 proceeds with her decision to die with dignity and end her own life. To do so, she uses a cocktail of drugs she has gathered throughout her time in the medical profession. It's a brief récit coming in at little over 100 pages in the Poche edition and focuses on the coming to terms with the mother's decision and the forms of care such a process involves. The second récit, Suite à la Dernière Leçon, written more than a decade later, follows the development of the filmic adaptation of La Dernière Leçon and the author's involvement in the process. So on the screen, we have a picture of the first of the books together under one cover, and it features a pair of hands, one visibly older than the other, both presumably female, holding each other. And the movie poster has actress Sandrine Bonner carrying actress Marthe Villalonga on her back in a very nice field with some greenery behind it. The movie was released in 2015, and it's based on the book, but takes many creative liberties And Noël Châtelet has referred to this filmic adaptation as une trahison consentie, a consented to betrayal. But before I move on, I should talk about the mother. So the mother, Mireille d'Andieu-Jospin, 1910 and 2002, was a midwife and activist. She engaged in multiple fights for reproductive rights. And more importantly, she was also a member of the Association pour le droit de mourir dans la dignité, the Association for the Right to Die with Dignity. She is survived by her 4 children, Noël, Agnès, Olivier, and Lionel, whom we might know as former French Prime Minister Lionel Jospin. I won't have time to get into all the nitty-gritty of right to die legislation, but I will say that France doesn't actually have any. So all the laws that were enacted following her mother's death. So we have a law in France that's called the Cli-Leonetti law, which is adopted in 2016, which is a continuation of the law Leonetti, which was published in enacted in 2005, but was deemed insufficient by lawmakers. So this law makes legal provisions for end-of-life scenarios. It has many, many articles, so I won't get into the details of it. They're controversial, and they also entangle with the Hippocratic Oath in rather interesting ways. So what it does do, it grants terminally ill patients the right to continuous deep sedation, CDS, until death. And France was the first country in the world to legitimate this practice. And this was proposed as an alternative to euthanasia and presented as the French response to end-of-life scenarios. And the second point is that it gives all individuals the right to indicate in advance the situations in which they do not wish to find themselves at the end of life. So whether or not they want life support to be taken off, etc. And these are laws that are binding on the doctor. And this is one of the major takeaways. And the doctor must now act in accordance with the wishes of his patient rather than act solely for the benefit of his patient. So in the international situation, we have several countries in Europe that have right to die legislation. And Switzerland, for instance, is the only country that allows foreign nationals to benefit from their right to die legislation, but it's actually quite expensive. It comes up to something like £10,000 to do so. The Netherlands has by far one of the most liberal right to die legislations, but we shouldn't forget that it is often heralded as a beacon of progress with excellent care facilities for the elderly. So care and end-of-life scenarios go hand in hand. And throughout these texts, Châtelet makes multiple references to the international status of right to die legislation and states that France is behind on its international counterpart, which I would suggest is a rather glorifying overview of the situation. This is perhaps in no small measure due to the geographical proximity of the countries which allow it, such as Switzerland, the Netherlands, and Belgium, and perhaps even cultural similarities. Most of the countries that allow it in the world are Western countries. So the legal framework, however, I will say, may generate different states of preparedness in countries where assisted suicide is allowed. One may envisage this as a possibility. But even in countries where there's a robust right to die legislation, the percentage of self-elected deaths sits somewhere around 5%, usually less. I won't have time to go into the terminology. There's euthanasia, there's assisted suicide, and assisted dying. What I will say, however, is that there is no consistency across international borders. So the first problem I encountered when deciding to talk about this text was the linguistic question. As you can see, the term assisted suicide is in inverted commas in my title. And after some reflection, I believe that self-assisted dying would be a more elegant and appropriate solution, which is not a way to circumvent the idea of suicide, since this was a death announced and discussed, as well as prepared for in a family context. But then came the second question. Since this is an active decision on the part of the subject, a verbal construction is essential. Does one commit the action of dying? Does one undergo it? Fortunately, we're not bound to legal terms here, so we have the choice of several expressions, with the French being even more helpful. In English, you end your life, but I much prefer the French mettre fin à ses jours, to end one's days, literally translated, which implies a refusal of the consecutiveness of days and highlights individual ownership of one's life. Secondly, we have se donner la mort, giving oneself death, as if it were a gift, and we often employ giving the gift of life in English. Why should death not be valorized as well? Because of her mother's profession as a midwife, the parallels come up frequently in the book. In an attempt to overturn the tragic character usually attached to death and even invoking it as a joyous event. So she says in la dernière leçon, ce paradoxe-là ne m'avait pas non plus échappé. N'est-ce pas étrange, maman, qu'une sage-femme qui aide à donner la vie puisse se donner la mort? And in more essentialized form, she goes back to this in suite. Mettre au monde, sortir du monde, un seul et même geste. Dans la joie, pourquoi pas? The mother's final action is referred to as a gesture, and it is only twice brought up in relation to suicide. So this is, the first quote is in the beginning of the text when she's still trying to come to terms fully with her mother's decision, although her mother had always announced that she will die, as she said, with dignity. Ça, ton geste, je n'arrivais pas à lui donner de nom, mais surtout pas celui de suicide, si hideux à dire, à penser, et si éloigné de l'image que tu voulais donner de ta résolution. Que parler du sens du geste en permettrait l'abstraction. And later on, when it's the very last time that she sees her mother, ma réponse est venue toute simple. Aussi simplement que la phrase de ta mort annoncée, sans effet de manche, sans agressivité non plus. Eh bien non, je n'ai rien, presque rien, et j'ai répondu, souriante, sinon que tu vas te suicider la semaine qui vient et que je te vois aujourd'hui pour la dernière fois. In preparation for her final gesture, the mother establishes the rules and sets very clear boundaries, which allows for new forms of care to emerge. It is very important to underline the mother's positionality as a parent and as an individual with autonomy, who in many ways refuses the inversion of a position of caring that often occurs in late age, with the child becoming the parent's caretaker as the frailty of old age irreversibly installs itself. And if we want to think of a famous literary example, Barthes and his mother Henriette come to mind, and with Barthes often referring to her in the text of mourning as sa fille who died. As I promised in the abstract, the discussion today was to be set for the prism of an ethics of care, but thus came my first theoretical roadblock. And I compiled a very brief yet necessary list of definitions around the concept of care, which will quickly illuminate my conundrum. These are the shorter versions. Of course, the ethics of care has extremely complex definitions of what care entails. So in the Care Manifesto, published by the Care Collective in 2020, it's a little book published by Verso, they define care as a social capacity and activity involving the nurturing of all that is necessary for the welfare and flourishing of life. Laugier, Sandra Laugier, who is one of the most important theoretical voices within the field, presents it in the following terms. Care is a concrete matter that ensures maintenance and continuity of the human world and form of life. Care can be thus conceived as the protection of forms of life. John Toronto says that care consists of everything we do to continue, repair, and maintain ourselves so that we can live in the world as well as possible. So care appears as a life-sustaining force throughout. So I thus came to a blind spot in the ethics of care, for theorists have only obliquely engaged with the question of potential exit avenues at the end of life. In the same Care Manifesto, they say, what we now ask would happen if we're to begin to put care at the very center of life. Well, what happens when we have to place death itself at the center of an ethics of care? That death has not been at the forefront of care is largely due to the fact that an ethics of care needs to first establish its influence on the production of the conditions for a good life. And if there is any term, umbrella expression under which we can put the global situation, I think it would be a failure of care at all levels. So a few vital questions arise. How are we to have a good death when most of us are not even having a good life in the ever-encroaching neoliberalist logic that affects time, space, and community? How is care to be understood through the language of death itself? I believe that Chatelet's text can begin to point us in a new direction as she rewrites what I call a pedagogy of care throughout La Dernière Leçon. In a gesture respecting her mother's autonomy and determination, Chatelet positions herself as an apprentice, with the mother teaching her de comment mourir, the how to die. While they are both engaged in a choreography of mourning, as they call it, chorégraphie du deuil, they are both learning to let go and not let the emotional charge and pathos overwhelm and overshadow their last days together. J'ai appris la mort autrement, dans un langage inconnu et finalement familier. Une nouvelle langue maternelle en quelque sorte, celle de la mère qui s'en va. The positioning of the author as a child being taught a lesson is stylistically echoed in the dialogical passages, whereby the author adopts a childlike tone punctuated by repetitions and short phrases, often in the interrogative mode. So for instance, she asks, Maintenant, es-tu sûre que c'est maintenant? Oui, ma chérie, je suis sûre, je le sais. Moi seule peux le sentir, le savoir. C'est maintenant. Après, ce sera trop tard. Despite the fact that we expect our parents to die before us, the determined and known duration of the period of togetherness left offers the daughter a condensed temporality. The question that is at the center of Chatelet's conundrum bears weight on our current times. How to live for a present when the very possibility of a future is foreclosed. Care takes on different dimensions, not just offering physical and emotional proximity, but also withdrawing at vital moments and refusing pathos. This dimension of care presented as withdrawal extends also beyond the relationship with her mother. Chatelet does not talk about her other siblings in either book. No, actually, sorry, in La Dernière Leçon, and it's revealed in the suite that it was agreed between them that this will be only about Noël's journey. The book is dedicated to her sister, Agnès. It's to Agnès that I dedicate this book. She and I only know why, she says in suite. This fragile choreography du deuil is enacted by both mother and daughter. And there is a withdrawal inherent in care, and this is very encapsulated very beautifully in a birthday scene, so to speak. Noël receives every year for her birthday a call from her mother at the precise moment of her birth, with her mother imitating the sounds of a newborn. But on the very last anniversary that the phone call is supposed to come, it does not materialize at the established ritualized time. And a bout of panic ensues, with the author believing her mother to be dead, but then the phone rings. Pourquoi n'étais-tu pas au rendez-vous de la naissance? Soudain, tout s'est éclairé. Mes yeux se sont ouverts. Je t'ai imaginé, je t'ai vue vivante, bien vivante cette fois, près de ton téléphone, dans ta maison. Tu attendais que j'attende moins. Tu attendais que je n'entende plus. Plus exactement, que j'apprenne à ne plus attendre cet appel rituel, justement cette année, cette dernière année. Tu nous as protégés toutes deux d'un excès d'émotions qui nous a brisés, je crois. A couple of pages later, she says, j'ai fini par comprendre que, avec toi, je venais de vivre mon premier anniversaire sans toi. Je n'avais pas pleuré. So the mother withholds from the daughter the exact particulars of her death as well. The daughter knows and trusts that her mother will go peacefully, but she does not know when. The daughter sees the stack of coins that her mother keeps to give to people to buy her the newspaper, and she can appraise how many days she will be receiving the daily newspaper for, but decides not to count them and only be left with an estimate. However, throughout the text, the temporal compression engenders a heightening of the emotional charge, even though this is not necessarily shared with the mother. De nouveau m'est revenue la compulsion du calendrier. Dans l'agenda, le taux se resserrait. Sur mon cou, il se resserrait. The rituals of self-care her mother enacts are a far cry from what the neoliberalist messaging hurls at us every day. The mother is actively engaged in leaving behind her affairs in order and preparing herself for this final act. Self-care becomes labor, and it is intensely active. Travail, c'est ainsi que tu nommais toi-même les préparatifs. J'ai beaucoup de travail encore, où il faut que je me remette au travail, me disais-tu, pour désigner la mise en ordre, les rangements nécessaires en prévision de ton départ. Following her mother's death, Châtelet herself engages in labor for what are creative practices, but another dimension of care, of maintenance. I'll go back a slide, sorry. The way that we, the living, maintain relationships with the dead reveals itself as another form of care. As Lisa Barrett remarks, by maintenance, I'm referring to durational practices that keep things going. Objects, selves, systems, hopes, ideals, networks, communities, relationships, institutions. These durational practices are forms of labor that maintain the material conditions of ourselves and others, maintain connections between people, people and things, things and things, people and places, and social and public institutions, along with the anachronistic ideals that often underpin them, and that constitutes the systems of sustenance and renewal that support life. By way of conclusion, I want to make reference to a discussion Châtelet had while promoting Suite à la dernière leçon. She was invited on the set of La Grande Librairie, and she recounts, as well in the suite, as well as during this encounter, that elderly people wrote to her asking for the recette, for the actual recipe to die with dignity. And François Bunel understands it in the metaphorical sense. And Châtelet has to set the record straight. It's not a secret to living well or to dying well. No, people want the actual recipe, what cocktail of medication she used. This misunderstanding, albeit momentary, is nonetheless telling in that it signals an unpreparedness in society to openly discuss the mechanical means for which one seeks to die with dignity. In matters of both life and death, governmental and cultural forces yet again put the onus on the individual to take care of the self. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adina. That was fantastic. I really loved the sort of the ethical, the political, but also the linguistic framing of death that comes through here, which is very important. And I think at the end we might come back to this idea about how it is that sort of conceptually we tie together an ethics of care with thanatology, which, as you say, raises so many questions and is so problematic in terms of a lot of the scholarship that's been done so far. So really, really rich and so much to think about. Thank you very much. And we're going to come now to our second speaker. We'll take all our questions at the end, but for the audience, please feel free to put comments in the comment box as we go along. But for now, we're going to pass over to Lucia Lopez Serrano, who is a research fellow funded by the Spanish government and a PhD student at the University of Salamanca in Spain. Lucia's postgraduate studies focus on an analysis of the intersection between vulnerable bodies and the medical establishment in contemporary Canadian literature, with a particular focus on the encounter of post-colonial thought and the field of the medical humanities. And Lucia's paper this afternoon is entitled Opting Out of Resilience in the Psychiatric Ward, the Dilemma of Assisted Suicide in Miriam Tev's All My Puny Sorrows. So over to you, Lucia.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for your presentation. Good evening, everyone. Before I begin, I just wanted to extend my thanks to the organizers, to Ben and Becky, for accepting my paper and being so flexible with the scheduling of this panel, so I could be here today. And to all of you who are listening and participating, I hope you and yours are as well as can be under the current circumstances we live in. Also, since my talk deals with very, very sensitive topics, I wanted to include a detailed trigger warning before I start, so you can, feel completely free of to mute me and just skip this talk entirely. I will be addressing suicide, attempted suicide, and some traumatic after effects, both physical and emotional, suicidal ideation, and medically assisted suicide at length during my talk. Unfortunately, I will at certain points graphically describe suicide attempts, which is not an indulgence in morbidity, but something necessary for the development of my arguments. However painful, it is my firm belief that the discussion of these topics is very necessary and will hopefully prove constructive to help us build around a reality that is usually seen as nothing but destructive and often also profoundly traumatic. So if I haven't scared you completely after this, I would want to begin by addressing not All My Puny Sorrows, but a previous book by the same author, Miriam Taves. So in 1998, Mel Taves, who was a school teacher and a faithful member of the Mennonite Church in Manitoba in Canada, took his own life after a lifelong struggle with bipolar disorder that was complicated by a diagnosis of early onset dementia. And he committed suicide by throwing himself under a moving train. A year later, his daughter Miriam wrote this first book that I have included here, Swing Low, Alive, which was a literary exercise in empathy in which she takes her father's voice and attempts to articulate his thoughts during his last forced hospital stay and the days before he took his own life. And where one may expect Taves' words to be tainted with rage or saddled with the trauma and sadness of her father's violent end, the author managed to compose a book filled with humor and love that is beyond anything else life-affirming. I know this is hard to believe, but the last written words, the book is based on some note that Mel Taves took during his stay at the hospital. And his last written words, as reported by his daughter, are a dedicated advice to the successful survival of little Hercules, a premature baby that lied at the other side of the hospital hall during Mel Taves' whole stay. So while Swing Low is not my main focus today, I consider this information necessary to understand All My Puny Sorrows, that was published by the same author, Miriam Taves, in 2014. This time after her sister Marjorie killed herself in the same way their father had done 12 years before, by throwing herself under a train. This time, All My Puny Sorrows is not a memoir, but a fictionalized account of her sister's death and her family's struggle with the aftermath. This is Taves' sixth book, and it constitutes a complicated reflection on chronic depression and the ethics of suicide. So the book is narrated by Yolandi, or Jolie, a chaotic, aspiring writer and single mother of two. but the book's focus is her elder sister Elfrieda's Elf, based on Taves' sister Marjorie. And Elfrieda has a long life struggle with chronic depression, despite her seemingly perfect life, her husband's love, and her sister's effort. Elf has been forcibly confined to the psychiatric ward of a Winnipeg hospital after her latest suicide attempt, which is certainly not the first. So diagnosed with chronic depression as a young adult, Elf has attempted to kill herself several times, almost dying of voluntary starvation, also after drinking bleach and purposefully overdosing on pills, and violently cutting her wrists. After her latest suicide attempt and still confined to the psych ward, Elf pleads with her sister Jolie to help her go to Switzerland so she can die peacefully through assisted suicide, a wish that an outraged Jolie outright denies. So on this contradiction between the question posed by Elf to her sister and Jolie's conviction that she must care for a sister bent on self-destruction is the conflict of the book, which is best summarized, I think, in this quotation from the beginning of the novel, when Jolie succinctly says, "It was the first time that we had sort of articulated our major problem. She wanted to die, and I wanted her to live, and we were enemies who loved each other." In the imaginary constructed by Jolie's narration and her conversations with Elfrieda, the possibility of a peaceful death in Switzerland, assisted by medical means and with her sister's blessing, appears in stark contrast with Elfrieda's final attempt. Tired of waiting for Jolie to decide whether she will help facilitate her sister's passing or not, Elfrieda manages to escape her watchful supervisors at the hospital and jumps in front of a train on her birthday. It is only months after her sister's violent passing and in the path towards forgiveness both for herself and her dead sister that Jolie is able to reimagine Elfrieda's death as a peaceful journey both sisters take to Switzerland, where Elf is tired but serene, and her and Jolie can reminisce about their childhood over dinner and wine before going to see the doctor who will help ease Elf out of her life. In Yolandi's imagination and contrasted with the harrowing experience of mourning that Elf's suicide has caused, this medically sanctioned ending appears almost utopic and free of pain, and although unrealistic, it marks Jolie's reconciliation with her sister's undeniable wish for death. And I have included some sentences that describe the scene. So this is Jolie imagining a different death for her sister, and she says, "When the plane landed, we were in Zurich. Elf woke up and smiled sleepily, and I said, 'We're here.' There was a skylight over our bed, and we could see stars. Elfie took my hand. She put it on her heart, and I felt its strong and steady beat. We had an early appointment the next morning. Elf said it was like getting married or writing an exam. It's torture to have to wait all day, she said. Let's just get up, shower, and go." And these are the last words in the book. This final scene in which Jolie reimagines her sister's death and turns medicalized assisted suicide into a sort of a utopic dream in which no suffering is involved, stands at the opposite side of the spectrum of Elfrieda's real suicide attempts and final death, which through the years have caused emotional trauma to her family and left her with physical and emotional consequences. By showing on the one side desperate, physically violent and secretive attempts at suicide, and on the other, an unrealistic but aspirational voluntary passing, Taves does not attempt to answer the difficult ethical question of when to let go, but accurately pinpoints factors which worsen the damage. And front and center throughout the length of the book is the stigma surrounding suicide and mental illness. Obviously, the characters in the book are not safe from the Christian belief that suicide is a sin that permeates most of Western society. Having been raised in a Mennonite community, when news of Elfrida's suicide became widespread, Jolie is repeatedly told things like what we find in the following quotation. She told me that, in her opinion, to die by one's own hand is always a sin. I mean, everyone has personal agonies, sure, but to die by one's own hand, it's just so incredibly selfish. However, what seems worse, as told by Taves, is the continuous infantilization and dehumanization suffered by Elf in the psychiatric ward, where her refusal to leave is equated not only with lack of virtue and with selfishness, but also with the lack of intelligence and reason, and the denial of any sort of agency. Her mom couldn't bear to see Elf in the psych ward. That prison, she said, they do nothing. If she doesn't take the pills, they won't talk to her. They wait and they badger and they badger and they wait and they badger. She's a human being, she said again. The sanctioned perspective of the psych ward seems to be that cultivating individual resilience has become a personal virtue, by which recovering from situations of precarity and trauma has become part of the moral code of the individual. This aligns with Sarah Brackett's description of how resilience has been inextricably linked to the hegemony of neoliberalism, spanning the macro level of ecological and economic systems to the micro level of selves, and perhaps indicates why, despite the gradual secularization of medical ethics, the stigma of suicide is still so prevalent, and the laws surrounding assisted suicide so slow to change. The author reaffirms this view of the psychiatric ward when Jolie compares the different behavior of the medical staff towards patients inside and outside the ward. Seeing how Elf is treated like a recalcitrant child and denied privileges until she complies with the demands of the rules of said staff, Yolandi addresses the reader to caution. If you have to end up in the hospital, try to focus all your pain in your heart rather than your head. Visiting a relative who has suffered a cardiac event, she claims that it was all familiar to me. The gurney's in emergency, but hers was a cardio case, not a head case. So there were no lectures from the staff, no righteous psych nurse demanding of her, why won't you behave? In an interview given to The Guardian in 2015, Tate explains that after the experiences that first her father and then her sister underwent when under psychiatric care, she had so much anger towards the mental health system in Canada, the cruelty of it, the way patients are treated, infantilized, it almost seems criminalized. Although she is careful to also include examples of caring and compassionate medical personnel, she is clear that in her view, psychiatric care puts the blame on the patients. And I have to jump a bit here to get to my point, but basically, for me, the most subversive point that Taves makes in the book is their final reconciliation that Yolandi makes with her sister's wish to die. In this, the author subverts the neoliberal interpretation of resilience enforced by the psychiatric medical establishment, but also the fact that Jolie is shown to move beyond her anger at a perceived selfishness on the part of her sister and accept Elfrieda's wishes to end her life, allows her to fully engage in the process of mourning in a way that's transformative and fully resonates with Judith Butler's writings on mourning. And in case someone is not familiar with her work, I've just selected a quotation from The Politics of Mourning and Violence, in which Butler says that one mourns when one accepts that by the loss one undergoes, one will be changed. Perhaps mourning has to do with agreeing to undergo a transformation, and a transformation of both Yolandi and her family is what we see in the second part of the book when they recover from the traumatic events that surrounded Elfrieda's death. Before I finish, and just in case I have not convinced you to read the book yet, I just wanted to point out a beautiful account written by Canadian author Lawrence Hill on his mother's assisted death in Switzerland in 2018, from which I have extracted the quotation that you hopefully see in the screen right now. He says, "The fact that she loved me and all the others in our family didn't alter the simple fact that she wanted to die." I have found that the mourning and rebuilding process that Jolie and her family go through in the book after Elfrieda's death resonate profoundly with what Hill writes here, which was done in an effort to make Canadian law in assisted suicide a bit more inclusive. And with that, I will finish my part. And I just realized that I did not do the audio description of myself at the beginning. So I'm a white 26-year-old woman with brown hair and dark glasses, and I'm from Spain. So I will be glad to take your questions at the end of the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lucia. You've absolutely convinced me to read this book. I hadn't heard of it before today, but it's such a powerful, but such a tender account as well of these final moments in a relationship as much as anything. And I love your focus on the heart in your analysis there, that source or that site of both life and death in many ways. And I want to come back to that later. This sort of these moments of life in the presence or in the face of dying and death is something that I think is coming out in the papers so far today. So thank you so much. And we're going to pass right away to our final paper today. And our final paper comes from Marzia Beltrami. Dr. Marzia Beltrami received her PhD in Italian literature in Durham University in 2017, where she worked on a project exploring narratives that are designed to encourage their readers to navigate them as spaces. At her monograph based in this research, which is entitled Special Plots, Virtuality and the Embodied Mind in Baricco, Camilleri and Calvino, is to be published by Legenda in January 2021. After having been visiting research fellow at the Medical Humanities and Context Lab at Paris 3 Sorbonne Nouvelle in 2019-20, from September 2020, she has been postdoctoral researcher at the University of Tartu, and her current research project brings together cognitive narratology and narrative ethics to look at fantastic representations of bodies and minds in post-war Italian literature. So, Marzia, it's over to you, and your paper this afternoon is entitled Lara Romano's Nemari Estremi as Illness Narrative.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I'm just gonna share the screen. And in the meantime, I'll audio the script myself. So I'm a 33-year-old white woman with short brown hair. I'm wearing a necklace and a blue V-necked t-shirt. Okay. So here we go. Okay, so in my talk today, I would like to focus on a novel by the Italian author Lalla Romano, published in 1987 and entitled Nemari Estremi. Its title might be translated as On the Far Side of the Sea. And because of the novella by Hans Christian Andersen that originally inspired the title of the story of the book, that features a sailor stranded in the farthest land of the North Pole, it seemed appropriate for my presentation to use some pictures of a snowy landscape that I took here in Estonia, which is not the North Pole, but it's the closest thing I know to it. So all my slides are gonna feature a snowy landscape with some trees. And yet, Nemari Estremi is not a novel about the North Pole, nor about voyages, at least not literal ones. Written in the first person by a narrator called Lalla, Nemari Estremi was published 3 years after the death of Romano's husband, Innocenzo. Generally speaking, there is no doubt that it can be regarded as a reflection on and a celebration of their love and their 52 year marriage in the aftermath of his passing. The novel is structured in 2 parts, entitled 4 Years and 4 Months. In the first part, Romano focuses on the first 4 years of her relationship with Innocenzo, from their first meeting through courtship and engagement up to their wedding and honeymoon. The second part, instead, focuses on the last 4 months of Innocenzo's life, starting when he finds out about his terminal illness up to a few weeks after his death on 1st October 1984. Le Mari Estremi has been described as a novel and a journal, because if on the one hand, Romano's first-person narrative voice explicitly sets out to tell her story at some point after Innocenzo's death, the fragmentary structure of the narrative and the chapter's episodic nature and length, which varies from half a page to 3-page maximum, reminds one of the entries of a journal. For the sake of simplicity, I will say that this narrative belongs to the hybrid genre of autofiction, as does most of Romano's narrative production, who relies mostly on her autobiographical, on her life. The discussion can be made more complex, but since this is not the topic of my discussion today, I'll leave it as that. However, I would like to point out that to assess the degree to which Romano's narrative is fictional or otherwise is not particularly relevant, because its value does not lie in the author's testimonial position, but I believe in the specific artistic form she gives to her experience as a carer, and thus in the set of strategies she proposes to represent and address certain issues linked to this role, the role of caregiver. So my intention is not to show how Romano's novel is a textbook account of the carer experience, nor to produce a sort of medicalized reading of her story. My expertise lies in the territory of literary criticism and theory, and so in bringing together the medical humanities and literature, my ultimate focus is on the latter, is on literature. My aim on this occasion, therefore, is to illustrate how drawing on the medical humanities arguably allows me to achieve a greater appreciation of the novel through a more nuanced view of its motives and a better understanding of its structure and why it is structured in a certain way. At the same time, though, to read Le Mari Estremi as an illness narrative also means to foreground how Romano indirectly and perhaps unconsciously politicizes the illness experience in 2 main respects. On the one hand, she claims for herself the right to tell her own story, thus ascribing full dignity to the role of the carer as someone who, despite not being the site of the disease, has nonetheless been profoundly affected by the illness and is entitled to a subjective experience of it. On the other hand, by voicing her own difficulties and her resistance against the role of carer, Romano breaks the silence and the social taboo around the function of spouses as informal carers, and around the assumption in particular that such role should be taken on seamlessly and naturally. So both these points reveal a specific focus on the figure of the carer, whose reappraisal has been advocated in particular by the branch of the critical medical humanities. So let's start by offering an initial definition of what is generally intended as illness narrative. The identification of illness narratives as a specific category of stories builds on Arthur Kleinman's distinction between disease, that is the biomedical dysfunction affecting the sick body, and illness, which includes the broader and the subjective impact the disease has on the person in a more holistic fashion. Illness narratives are therefore stories which give expression to the subjective and lived experience of the illness. So there is no doubt that Innocenzo's absence looms large over Romano's authorial mind, and it is frequently proleptically hinted at also in the first part of the book. But if the book is undoubtedly influenced by the mourning process, the narrative itself is more, or at least equally intensely concerned with Romano's attempt to come to terms with Innocenzo's illness rather than his death. Not only it narrates what changes he goes through and how these affect their relationship and Romano's everyday life, but also how this unprecedented perspective prompts Romano to rethink her husband and herself. It is no accident that the watershed between the two parts of the book is marked by the first manifestations of Innocenzo's final illness, not by his death. So to read Maria Estremi as an illness narrative allowed me to foreground two main patterns of images and consideration that otherwise might have been overlooked, and I would like to focus on with you today. The first pattern highlights the prominent role of the body played by the body throughout the novel, while the second reveals an implicit ongoing reflection on the conflict between self and social identity, prompted in Romano by her new function as informal carer. So, in illness narratives, the body in its materiality becomes the central and inescapable site in which the disease manifests itself, and which undergoes often disturbing changes as a result. The medical humanities have explored the overpresence of the body in experiences of illness, and it should not come as a surprise how in this context the rediscovery of the body is mostly forced on the individual and tinged with negative side effects. David Biro, for instance, notes that illness, and I quote, forces us to acknowledge our bodies and our dependency on them. In even stronger tones, Litz Brewster observes that, and I quote again, when a person undergoes treatment, they become a body colonized by medicine, and for a time, their social context is lost. Romano's account, in this sense, is no exception. On the one hand, the body stands out importantly as the first site of betrayal, when the disease's first symptoms reveal themselves in Innocenzo's pale appearance. And I quote, "First, it was the pallor during a dinner party," Romano writes. Indeed, in the second part of the novel, Romano tells about her struggle with coming to terms with the rapid deterioration of her husband's body, its small indiscreet failures first, and then the loss of independence, immobility, and personal care, and finally the progressive loss of the self following the shutting down of the body. However, while of this experience of deterioration, she can only be the vicarious witness. What Romano gives us an authentically personal account of is how her experience as carer triggered a process of retrospective recognition of the importance of corporeality to cure. As if in anticipated response to her husband's failing body, unlike in any other novel by Romano, the first part of Maria Estremi abounds with physical descriptions of Innocenzo, of his strong body, of his hands. The double structure of the novel arguably aims precisely at coming to terms with a disturbing coexistence in Romano's mind of two irreconcilable images of her late husband. And yet, far from reasserting the irreducible juxtaposition, my suggestion is that the juxtaposition of the two parts so mirrors the initial state of things, the immediate aftermath of her ordeal. But what the narrative does is to rebuild the bridge between the beginning and the end of their life together. This is achieved, for instance, through numerous temporal jumps back and forward, which emphasize the continuity between the two parts. So by restoring this continuity between Innocenzo's bodily presence as a young and desired man and as a dying spouse, Romano takes ownership of his body back from the illness, reverting the process of estrangement triggered by the devastation of the disease. The second consequence concerning corporeality, though, is equally fascinating. Romano's rediscovery is not limited to reconstructing her sense of Innocenzo's body, but it arguably develops into an overall reappraisal of the body and of its key role in accessing reality and making sense of experience. What I mean is that on several occasions, corporeality emerges as a powerful epistemological channel that operates in parallel with the rational intellect, sometimes even preceding it or contributing to achieve a deeper understanding. These are just some examples of sentences that we find in a novel. It wasn't an idea, it was a feeling. I thought, or better, I felt. I had always felt. So in all these instances, Romano seems to stress how comprehension is sometimes based on feeling rather than thinking. Parenthetic sentences and asyndetic coordination are two distinctive features of Romano's writing style. And here she uses these techniques to express, through syntactic juxtaposition, what in fact is the entwinement of perception and thought, which interacts with one another through progressive adjustment and approximation rather than opposition. In another example, Romano uses instead corporeality as a metaphorical repository of some sort. She writes, I used to think of us, him as something dry, hot, hard, and yet tender too. Me as something wet, burning, and yet also stony. So far from merely presenting her readers with a sexually oriented association of maleness with hardness versus femaleness as wetness, here Romano relies on haptic perceptions, not simply to represent, but to unfold her argument. So by playing with these images, she complicates the representation of her relationship with Innocenzo by formalizing through a chiasm-like structure rather than a juxtaposition. While her husband is characterized by a certain softness within an overarching dryness and solidity, her own core is more stone-like despite the description of her general personality as wet and hot. My suggestion, in other words, is that the strong presence of corporeality, not only in what Romano represents, but in how she represents it, is stimulated precisely by the heightened attention to the body determined by the illness experience. The second broad thematic pattern that I would like to highlight today with you, and highlighted thanks to the medical humanities perspective, concerns the impact of the illness experience on Romano's view of her social identity. The connection between illness narrative and questions concerning identity is indeed robust. In Arthur Frank's pioneering work, The Wounded Storyteller, his 3 types of narrative, the quest, the chaos, and the restitution narratives, are offered as pathways for the subject to reconstruct their own transformed or even shattered sense of self-identity. And equally, moving the focus on the figure of the carer, identity theory is often engaged to investigate the dynamics through which the role of informal carer is attributed, or to explore variation in self-identification. So not only the identity is a hot topic in the medical humanities, but also Romano herself is not new to questioning traditional roles. In one of her previous novels, Le parole tra noi leggere, Romano explores the relationship with her son and her unconventional feelings towards motherhood and childbearing. In Nei mari estremi, she displays an equally troubled attitude towards her role as wife. If on the one hand, she does not hide nor regret her emotional and practical reliance on her husband on many occasions, on the other hand, she's adamant in professing her independence as well as her intolerance for the roles entailed by marriage. I've always been alone in the sense of free. I've always loathed, not less than today, the words wife, husband, mother-in-law, daughter-in-law, and so on. Such, grotesque, macabre, was the tone and rhythm of that evening when I became a widow, which is itself a word fit for comedy. These are all like excerpts from passages from Nei mari estremi, and we can see how Innocenzo's illness puts Romano in the unprecedented position of having to take care of him in a way that she's not used to, nor prepared for. On the one hand, she resists as long as she can the intrusion in her everyday life of agents and practices connected to Innocenzo's illness. She admits she deliberately refused to inquire about the name of the organ first affected by the disease, discovering it only afterwards. And yet, on the other hand, there are plenty of instances that demonstrate how Romano, almost despite herself, ultimately qualifies as an informal carer, inasmuch as not only she provides emotional support, but also accomplishes household tasks. She administers drugs, takes care up to a certain point of Innocenzo's pastoral care. She acts as gatekeeper, manager of professional carers and medical figures, and referent for all the activities prior to and following his death. Her function as caregiver places her at the center of a conflicting tension between her own needs, her unquestionable love for Innocenzo, and what she perceives to be the conventional expectations and demands attached to her role as wife. One passage is particularly telling both of the ambivalent stance of Romano towards illness and of the originality of her reflection and narrative operation. From inattention to dedication, perhaps. I'm not saying to abnegation, as it would be too much, as a word and as a concept. Dedication was natural. It was all I'd left. If it is true that one has what one can give. But it was still me. And there was a moment, which now seems monstrous, a moment of impatience. Not a fit, but rather something deliberated in full recklessness. Given my scant nature as housewife, I never paid any attention to even less careful men clothing. Now I was helping him getting dressed, and I felt impatient. It was so complicated. I said, "Can't you use a dressing gown?" I did not realize it meant, "You're never going to get dressed again." And he accepted it, because it was still him who understood and indulged me. So this excerpt captures the core of this tension. First, we have the acknowledgement of the fact that in order to stand up to her new role, Romano had to transform, to shift from an initial condition of selfishness to dedication. Even more, she comes to see these as the unavoidable form her love must take to meet her partner's needs. The adjective natural arguably describes the aptness of this new form rather than the effortlessness. By contrast, in fact, she adds, "But it was still me," as if to indicate that her true nature remains to some extent unfamiliar with this new caring behavior. And then she goes on to recount one of her worst, most regretted blunders. Unfortunately, I don't have time to expand on this today, but I think that here it lies one of the major qualities and most interesting aspects of Romano's narrative. In this matter-of-factness with which she sees her flaws and her difficulties, in this highly uncommon balance between being unforgiving and unapologetic at the same time, which potentially holds a precious message for her audience. So in this last part of my presentation, rather than attempting to unravel the conflictual aspect of Romano's struggle, I would like to bring you to your attention two strategies through which she attempts to find a reconciliation between the caring function and her instinctive resistance to it. The first strategy consists in emphasizing the joint identity of Innocenzo and herself as a couple. In this way, her caregiving practice ceases to be an act of abnegation and self-denial, and is framed as a positive reformation of herself through reinforcing the couple. Recent research does suggest that, and I quote, "having a greater sense of we-ness or couple identity may serve as a cognitive resource and help to alleviate the negative effects on caregivers' mental health," end quote. And there are several instances in which Romano emphasizes these we-ness that I'm not going to read now, but you can see she explicitly appreciates that Innocenzo uses the we. The second strategy that I think she uses to, going back to the first strategy, it is therefore no accident that, unlike in any other previous work, the whole book hinges around this reconstructive operation of the marital relationship, with an equally strong emphasis on the we-ness and on Romano's personal need for independence, which are thus not mutually exclusive. The second strategy, elaborated by Romano to reconcile herself with her new role, consists in retrospectively projecting on her husband a positive, caring light. So the progressive characterization of Innocenzo as himself a caregiving person arguably reveals her attempt to uncouple the caregiving identity from the social role of wife and rearticulate it within a situated affective dimension. So by ascribing certain caring-related virtues to Innocenzo, it becomes not only bearable, but uplifting for her to maintain an analogous behavior. By using the word characterization and thus stressing the artificiality of the representation process, I'm not implying that Romano is lying either to herself or to the audience, to the readership. However, I do intend to stress the artificiality of the narrative practice, thus going back also to the initial issue of autofiction, and to point out once again how the value of Romano's story also importantly lies in how she constructs her storytelling to fulfill specific purposes. In this case, that of stressing the lifelong caring function of Innocenzo and offering a certain hierarchy of virtues that contributes to endorse her new role. What makes her narrative particularly interesting is thus the coexistence of her attempt to reconcile herself with the caring role, and yet the assertion of her struggle as fully legitimate. To conclude, already in the introduction of Le parole tra noi leggere, Romano claims that when she designs narratives, her objective is to reconstruct a character or a relationship in order to be able to read it, to interpret it. In other words, Romano always writes in order to understand. Importantly, I believe that for Romano, understanding lies more in the narrative as a structured work of art, rather than in the writing process. By proposing to read Le mare estremi as an illness narrative, I basically suggest that illness is what Romano tries to understand more than anything else. In an earlier novel, she writes that when she was young and training as a painter, she reckoned she couldn't be a writer because nothing would have interested her as much as her own world. Perhaps therefore, it took an author as admittedly and unapologetically egocentric, in the good sense of the word, as Romano, to provide an insightful subjective account of an experience as complex as that of the carer of a beloved person. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marzia. It's fantastic. What three wonderful, wonderful papers. And I don't want to take up too much time sort of summarizing or asking questions. I want at this point to open up to our audience and to give you an opportunity to contribute some thoughts or some questions. Please do use the chat function for that, or much better even than that is if you go to participants at the bottom and click on that icon, and the list of participants comes up at the very bottom of that. Yeah, there's the raised hand button, so please do raise your hand, and I'll be delighted to bring you in the conversation in a moment or two. But I suppose just one thing I would like to say about the papers that came across for me that was very powerful is this idea that, yes, we're thinking about, in some cases, illness, in some cases that term is not appropriate at all here, but we're thinking about end of life in any case. And yes, we're thinking about the corporeal dimensions to that, and yes, we're thinking about the sort of physiological dimensions to that, and the emotive dimensions to that. But for me personally, at least, I thought one of the really important aspects that came through in all of the papers was this role that's played by the person who is present or who is accompanying the one at the end of life. And you know, it just made me think, whether we call that a caring role or not, sometimes that's appropriate, sometimes it's not, depending on the circumstance. You know, just thinking back to the very first paper, the Châtelet paper, I'm pretty sure, I have it on the shelf behind me somewhere, but I didn't want to go and dig it out during the papers there, but I'm pretty sure that the cover image for the Noël Châtelet, that Dernier Leçon, is like it's like a hand, the two hands are joined together. And in Lucia's paper, we had this lovely quotation about they're on the plane getting to Zurich, and that lovely quotation about putting the hand, the one person putting the hand on the heart of the other person and feeling a strong and steady beat. And then Marzia, you talked to us really powerfully about the this caring role, a role which is a privilege in some ways, that's clear to see for the protagonist, but is also a difficult role. There's a burden that comes with that, and I think that's really important, because we often simplify the role of carer these days. In the UK, at least, there's this new movement on a Thursday night to get people to go out and clap. It's no longer called clap for our carers, it's clap for our heroes. And so many of the people working in the front line, either in care homes or in the hospitals or whatever, they absolutely do not like that term of you know, being called a hero, because they recognize that this is a very difficult role. It's a role that comes with a huge emotional responsibility, a huge sense of fatigue. You need a lot of resilience, as Marzia said, to do that. So I thought actually that the three papers drew our attention in a very sensitive way to that role of being present with someone in dying and in death ultimately as well. But in any case, I just wonder, first of all, we'll sort of stay for maybe 15-20 minutes of some questions. I wondered, first of all, maybe if the three speakers, if there was anything you would like to say, having heard the other two people speaking, any of the themes or the concepts, the ideas that came across there that you thought were really interesting points of intersection for your own work, or any sort of brief responses you'd like to give to each other. Anybody like to sort of kick us off?
I'm happy to say just one thing. If no, actually, thank you also. I take the opportunity to thank the other two speakers. Just one brief thing, and I would be curious to ask you more, also perhaps later on, to Adina. More than a question, is, as you said, is a comment about another part that I didn't manage to put in the paper was exactly about language. So also what Stephen was mentioning. So and how hard it is to discuss about these things also in translation. So sometimes words fail you in language, and which in a way that they don't in the original one. For example, I was struggling with the word pietà, which is it could be translated with pietà and pudore, which is even more. Pudore means something like in English is something like shame. Is about like exposing yourself. And but in illness, pudore, it's something that is related to shame, but it's something also positive.
As a speaker of Romance languages, yeah, I get it. Yeah.
Sorry?
As a speaker of Romance languages, I get it.
Yeah. So yeah, it was more a comment about like how it's part of the work is already to establish a common ground in terms of what word means what do they frame. So it was very interesting to hear their comments on that and their paper also in this light.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's very important, actually. These cultural languages that we use to describe these moments of illness or suffering or end of life, they're often so heavily and particularly charged in different contexts that it can be very different to translate it, at least adequately, from one cultural context into another. I think that's a very interesting point. I don't know if Lucia, Adina, maybe you don't. I don't want to put you on the spot, but is there anything you want to say just briefly before we open this up about any points of intersection, points of thought, reflection that came to you from the other papers?
I was just reading Shirley Jordan's question in the chat that also relates very much to what you were saying before about the roles of care. And I would like to add something on that vein, because I think, well, I'm currently writing my dissertation which deals with different Canadian novels that address issues of hospitalization or the encounter with the medical establishment, let's call it that, in one way or another. But this is the only book that deals with just mental illness and not some kind of physiological illness. And I found the role of caring very interesting here, because especially since I told you at the beginning of my talk, the writer based the book on her personal experience dealing with the death of her sister Marjorie. And in several interviews, she talks about how it's writing the book was the process, part of the process of mourning and healing for her. And a big part of that was reconciling with the role of carer that her sister has had somehow forced upon her, because although a part of her very much agreed with the fact that she did not have any, her sister did not have a guilt that or had not committed a sin that she must receive forgiveness for. In a very emotional way, she felt the resentment and the anger that would a part of her perceived as a choice that was evitable had forced upon her. So although I did not have the time to go into this, a big part of the book are scenes of both sisters in the psychiatric ward, where Elfrieda is confined and Jolie accompanies her as much as she can. And I think it would be very interesting to examine the book or to compare it with a narration of care that's solely focused on a more physiological illness, perhaps. I may do that if I ever finish my dissertation. So we'll keep you updated.
Thank you for that. I'm just going to read Shirley's question into the audio, just so it's there for anybody following on the audio captions or following later via audio captions. And Shirley says, I'm very interested in the labour of care and wonder whether speakers could say anything more about the different and perhaps unanticipated forms that this labour takes as it's constructed between the carer and the one cared for, this idea of the labour of care. Adina, Marcia, do you want to add anything to that, this idea of labour of care as it comes across in the texts that you've been studying?
Yes, I think that a lot of the labor involved is in kind of the mother and the daughter knowing each other and knowing which affects to keep private and which affects to share. It comes across as if, you know, everything was jolly good and the daughter just accepted everything. But in fact, there is a lot of crying that she shares with her husband, a lot of crying on floors, but she never does this in front of the mother. And they do that in order to kind of preserve their integrity, in the sense they don't want to fall to pieces. So there's a lot of labor of negotiation of affects there. And a lot of the time, a few times in the text, the Châtelet uses, if I may say, a belabored, rather, a metaphor. Because her mother was a midwife, she often says that her labor of death is the same as her labor of the travail, women's labor when they give birth. And that's a little taking it a little too far, but the idea of labor comes up over and over again.
Thank you. Marcia, do you want to add anything to that?
Just a brief thing that that yes, like also what I found interesting in Romano's work is how she claims her right to be to say out loud that this process, even taking care of something that she loves, she never denies that, is something that is tiring and requires labors. And I didn't have the time to look into this, but there is this trajectory that she does from inattention to dedication. Is not just a matter of focused attention and realizing what needs of her husband are, but actually her learning to make the effort and to convince herself to make the effort. There is this trajectory in particular about managing to stay awake and to keep vigil with him, because she mentioned, like, throughout the book, mentioning different episodes, how she finds it hard. She just falls asleep. She cannot fight sleep. And so even though she wants to stay close, she cannot. And I think that this is such a small thing, if you want, like just not being able to renouncing to sleep. But I think that she does make the point that it's still labor, it's still an effort, and it shouldn't be taken for granted. And I think she creates a very careful, delicate balance between this need, the effort, and making sure that this effort is acknowledged somehow, the value of it. So yes, she does consider the labor. It's not physical labor most of the times, because she's bourgeois woman, she has nurses helping her, but still it's there.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, Stephen, can I interrupt for a sec? 'Cause I've got a question, but I can't do the raise hand thing because I'm a host.
Please do, Becky. Yeah.
A question from Ali Murphy just after Shirley's one. And the question is for Adina. And Ali says, I wanted to ask Adina to what extent the inability to have effective policy or even cultural thoughts surrounding end of life is still tied with a perhaps naive idea of death being depicted as the antonym of care and care being reduced to keeping someone alive at whatever cost. I think this very much relates to the circumstances in which we are all, quote, kept alive under capitalism, but would love to know Adina's thoughts. It's a great question.
Thank you for the question. That is a great question. Well, there is, before I answer this, there is a point that isn't necessarily discussed in the book is that religion still plays a fundamental role in French society. And the idea that life is precious at whatever cost very much still permeates society. So unfortunately, we are tied to the idea that keeping someone alive is the best form of care at whatever costs. This is another form of being pro-life, but without actually ensuring the material conditions to have a good life. It's just life at whatever costs. And I think this ties into abortion rhetoric as well. But that's a great question. Any more comments? Did I answer that in any way?
Yeah, I think you did. I can't. I must admit, I can't see all the questions in the chat. So Ben, Becky, just keep me right here. Ben, I see that you've one to Adina as well about CDS, continuous deep sedation. Do you wanna put that question at this point?
Yeah, it's just that this is the first time I've come across this idea of CDS, the continuous deep sedation. And I was just wondering from like a kind of narratological perspective, like, is there, is it possible to narrate this CDS or this kind of like pre-death sedation, whether or not it's induced or not, from a first person perspective, or is it always in terms of kind of the witnessing of the person who's with the dying person? As Stephen was saying, that a lot of the patients brought up the question of, and Shirley's question as well, the role of the carer and the witnessing also of the carer. I know, like, I've talked a little bit here about my own personal experience of my mum's death, and I was kind of obsessed with this question in her kind of final days, in which she was mainly unconscious of, what is her experience, and I don't know, can a voice ever be given to that experience, and what are they thinking about? I know that in terms of practical conversations with palliative care doctors, they get this question a lot. What is this family member thinking about? What are they experiencing in this form of deep sedation? And I always remember they said to us, oh, it's a bit like the way they put it to us was, it's like falling asleep on Christmas Day in front of the TV, in that you feel like you're just about asleep and you can kind of hear people talking around you, but you can't quite tell what they're saying. And I thought, well, I mean, I don't know. I don't know really. I guess I always thought, how can you tell what this person is experiencing? And then in terms of a writing narratological perspective, is it possible, or is it always a third person narrative, I guess?
I mean, it's kind of asking the dead to speak. I mean, there's no after necessarily that experience. In terms of whether or not it's narratable, I think only in a fictional sense, personally. The problem with this law, if I may go back to the legal situation, is that the idea behind the law is for them to take away suffering. But then again, they cannot tell whether or not the sedated patient is actually suffering, because, as you say, they may be thinking about all the demons and they can't move, and they can't ask for anything else. So this is a very fraught question, whether you relieve suffering by putting someone to sleep.
I don't see anything else in the chat at this point. Anybody like to unmute to ask any questions? Feel free just to, maybe if you want to raise your hand at this point. Maybe not. Going. You've got 2 or 3 minutes if you want to ask any burning questions that you may have. I don't see anything else in the chat, in which case, could I just ask one question? I mean, I was really struck, Adina, by this idea, this concept that you referenced about condensed temporality. And so I suppose just in relation to some of the images that came through in the other papers as well, of these moments, I talked about the heart, you know, putting the moment on the heart, touching the heart or feeling the heartbeat of someone as they're going off to prepare for their final days, of being with someone in their final days. It just brought me back to that phrase about condensed temporality, and I was wondering if in any of the texts that any of the three of you have talked about here, or more generally, if you've come across any reflections on, I don't know, the sort of continuities of life and death, where life ends, where dying begins. Is there any sort of reflection on the sort of the overlaps, the very complex temporality of living and dying, to put it in those terms?
I'm not working on on this boundary between life and death, but for example, Romano does speak about actually she uses I cannot find it, but an expression that is very similar to condensed temporality. She definitely makes reference to how time was incredibly expanded at some point, well, incredibly short before she knew that like her husband was definitely going to die. And then she was talking about this expanded temporality where days were becoming months and hours were becoming days at the very end. So when, I guess, to convey the sense that everything is, every last minute is worth. So it was expanded, perhaps also to give a sense of the silence that was growing also because Innocenzo, her husband, was losing touch with reality. But I think that in terms of from a more narratological perspective, so apart from this consideration that she does offer, I think it's quite interesting the way she structured her novel in this fragmentary way. So because like she does follow a chronological trajectory, but the entrances are, the entries, sorry, so each chapter follow themes. So in this sense, by also referring to previous times of their life, the time is completely rearranged. And you have the sense, this sort of the production in the text and in the structure of the text of these very much fluid temporality. So I was very interested to say that she used that expression condensed, because also in Romano does recur.
Yeah, my purpose in asking that question was, I mean, maybe condensed temporality doesn't fit for each case that we're talking about here today, but I suppose I was thinking more about you know, those moments when the patient is still very much alive, but the person who's with them is projecting into the space of death. Or conversely, in the space of dying, where there's moments of real vibrant life that come through at that time, and what sort of emotional reaction does that provoke in the other person, the person who's accompanying the one at the end of life? I guess I was thinking a little bit more like that. Is that something that any of the writers in the other texts sort of dwell on to any extent?
In terms of condensed temporality is how she also engages with her mother. She just decides that to condense the good times together. There's a lot of laughter. There are also these feasts that towards the end of her life, of her mother's life, they just eat oysters and caviar and just enjoy it to the fullest. So it's not necessarily condensed as, you know, trimming all the bad parts and enjoying life in its joyful essence. You know, she says at one point you have to love life a lot in order to want to die. So this is what she takes, and that's what she condenses into the last moments of her mother's life.
Thank you. And I see a question from Anna. This might be the last question we take. I'm just conscious of time here. Anna Elsner in the chat asks, or says, I would be interested to know more what role trust and the mistrust in medicine plays in these end-of-life accounts, in assisted dying narratives in particular, is mistrust in medicine always accompanying affirmations of the assisted suicide decision being expressive of autonomy. So the role of trust and mistrust in these accounts. Any of you like to comment on that?
Sorry, Adina, go ahead.
I think in Chatelet's case and the case of her mother, it's actually a question of trust in medicine, because she trusts that the recipe she has as a medical practitioner will allow her to die the kind of death that she wants.
In the case of the book I was dealing with, All My Puny Sorrows, I think this question is very relevant to the assessment of the book and addresses something that I think Taves ignores, and which was one of my main questions when I read her account, because we get to know the characters at a point in life when Elfrieda has already gone through several hospitalizations in the psychiatric ward, and she has attempted suicide, I think 5 times. So a trust that psychiatry can help her is never even considered. We are past that point when we begin reading the book. And Taves has said in many interviews like how her experience with the system in Canada was completely awful, both when her father was interned and when her sister was. But of course, we know that there are many cases, fortunately most cases, in which people with even dealing with chronic depression through treatment, both psychopharmacology and psychiatry and psychology can improve their quality of life and get better. So I found very interesting why in this book that deals so much with the stigma of mental illness that's actually never addressed. So in this case, because the sort of the psychiatric ward and the psychiatric and medical establishment sort of appears as something that infantilizes the patient and takes agency away from her. Yes, the decision to of the main character to seek assisted suicide is an expression of autonomy, and also I think of her mistrust or complete disregard for psychiatric medicine in this case.
Thank you. And I know people are beginning to leave, but I think we must take a final question from our co-organizer, Becky. Would you like to throw in one last question?
Yeah, I know it's very like cheeky of me. Sorry. It may be too big a question as well, but Lucia, I read All My Puny Sorrows as kind of like a broader reading for my own research into sort of depression and suicidal ideation. And I remember there was a quote towards the end when after Elf has died, I think, I'm trying to remember it, and I was trying to find it in the book stack but couldn't find it anyway. I think it's like Stephen, a friend, says that he wasn't surprised with her death, and how when he heard her play, I think she plays the violin, is that right? When he heard
the piano,
heard her play a pain that he couldn't access or something. And I was just wondering, this sort of like this big topic of pain and how that intersects maybe with the 3 speakers and the text that you're studying, because often like with assisted suicide or euthanasia, however you want to kind of conceptualize it, all the different forms of it, there's always a narrative of like ending pain, ending suffering, and that's always a part of like the justification in a way, or the kind of the rationale, and part of the choice and the autonomy. So I was just wondering kind of how pain is represented in the 3 works. And I know this is a topic that will be interesting for Stephen and Anna as well, who are kind of working on publication on pain as well. anyway, but it's a massive question, so I appreciate it's getting late.
So to address it very quickly, in All My Puny Sorrows, I think the biggest expression of pain that we see, or the main argument the author makes really, is that not so much Elf's artistic expression in her piano playing, but that her many suicide attempts have been extremely violent and physically damaging to her body. I think at one point it is described that she drank bleach in an attempt to kill herself, and that left her with little or no use of her vocal cords. So I think because the narrator is the sister, she cannot directly face the pain Alfreda is experiencing. In fact, it's very surprising, but I don't know if you found this, but I think All My Puny Sorrows is a very optimistic and positive book. The general tone, because it's so humorous and so focused on healing and recovering from pain. I did not find much focus on that, but I have to reread it again soon to teach it. So I will look through it again through that prism.
I can very briefly add on it, because also in Romano, pain doesn't feature prominently. It's not a major theme, but for example, Romano is very matter of fact about illness and about what that means for her. And she says that she has a physical repulsion for witnessing other people's pain, particularly Innocenza, but in general, she has never been very sick herself, so she has no personal experience, and pain is the only thing that makes, and the perspective of not having her husband feeling pain is the major breakthrough that allows her to accept drugs and official medical care, because she doesn't very much question it at that point. So it's the entry point for her in a sort of more medicalized context, like to accept that she needs drugs for her husband not to feel pain. And that's pretty much how that features, I would say, in the novel.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we'll leave it at that point. I just want to read into the record very briefly. I'm just going to compress Loic's comment. It's a really helpful comment in the chat on this idea of compressed time that we spoke about a moment ago, and Loic draws our attention to the fact that in HIV/AIDS literature, this idea of compressed time is quite central. Death is always looming or lurking around, so many narratives demonstrate a form of excess or acceleration, ralentissement, too. And with this idea of the Bergsonian idea of subjective versus objective time, which is quite a tension in these narratives. I thought that was a very helpful comment for Loic. I just wanted to capture it for anyone following this conversation afterwards when it's recorded and uploaded to the website. So thank you to the three of you so much for your really rich and stimulating papers, for engaging with the conversation, the questions so openly and so generously. It's been, I've learned so much this afternoon. It's been a fantastic session. I'm really looking forward to reading some of these texts. And I think at this point, the three of you deserve a very large glass of something this evening. Thank you very much. And I'm going to hand back to Becky and Ben just to close and maybe tell us what's coming up next in the series.
Thanks so much, Stephen, and thanks so much to all of the presenters tonight. Honestly, that was absolutely fantastic. Yeah, so I know it's kind of getting a little bit later, so we'll let everyone get to dinner. But just to announce the next seminar, which is Seminar 9, this will be on pregnancy and childbirth, and that will be on Tuesday, the 26th of January at the same time of 5:30 UK time. We'll have another guest chair. This will be Dr. Amelina Damle from Durham University, and we'll have 3 papers. The first by Laura Lazzari on how to achieve a positive birth experience, female agency and childbirth in Swiss Italian literature. And then we'll have a second paper with two speakers that will be collaborating, Priyanka Tripathi and Soumya Kashyap, called Practicing the Humanities, Female Fertility, Artificial Reproductive Technology and Contemporary Indian Women's Writing. And then a third paper by Kalyan Ung, entitled The First Days of Maternity in Contemporary French Literature. So hopefully you can all join us again for that. And I think Becky's put the link in the chat. And yeah, thanks so much to everyone for coming. Happy New Year again. And yeah, see you all next time. Thanks very much again, everyone.